Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking an intense exploration into Kenya's complex path to self-rule, peeling back the layers on a period often glossed over in standard historical accounts.
It really is. And it's so necessary to do this deep dives because Kenya was, in many ways, the jewel in the crown that the British Empire was most reluctant to let go of.
You can feel that reluctance, can't you?
You really can, even decades later. You have Reginald Maudling, who was the colonial secretary handling the final phase, and he recalled in 1978 that Kenya was the greatest problem of all for Britain.
The greatest problem.
Yes, but in the same breath, he still called it the outstanding example of British influence in Africa. And that quote, for me, just captures the deep, strategic, and almost emotional weight the colony held for them.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to analyze the rich sources you have provided, which are structured around three core questions that really define this era from 1945 to 1964. First, what forces drove the independence movement? Second, how was freedom actually achieved, balancing that violent resistance with the constitutional talks?
And finally, what were the immediate challenges they faced when trying to forge a new national identity?
Exactly. And crucially, we're looking at the intertwined threads of political negotiation, severe internal security crises, and Britain's enduring defense interests in the region.
And before we dive in, I think we have to give a huge thank you to the incredible resources we consulted.
Oh, definitely.
For anyone listening who is eager to delve into the finer points of this history, including, detailed scholarly analysis and the historical debates, we really encourage you to visit Russell Tarr at activehistory.co.uk.
That's activehistory.co.uk. It's an invaluable resource for this period.
Truly.
Okay, so let's frame the central historical debate that colors every decision we're about to discuss. Was Britain's decolonization process in Kenya genuinely magnanimous?
Right. Was this noble act of nation building designed to prepare Africans for self-governance?
Or, and this is what our sources strongly indicate, was it a pragmatic, sometimes even cynical, exercise driven primarily by the need to secure their own defense posture and internal stability in a post-Suez world?
We're looking beyond the rhetoric.
We are. We're getting into the cold calculus of power transfer. So, to get to the heart of that first question, what prompted the emergence of the independence movement? We have to start with the foundational issue.
Land. It always comes back to land.
Always.
To understand the independence movement, you first have to understand that the colonial administration wasn't just, governing. They were actively reshaping the entire socioeconomic landscape in a way that guaranteed conflict.
How so?
Well, as the historian Bruce Berman documented back in 1990, the administration deliberately imposed policies that resulted in mass land dispossession from indigenous African communities.
And we're talking about the best land, right? The most fertile areas.
The very best. The fertile highlands, specifically. They were set aside for European settlement. And this wasn't just an inconvenience. It caused severe structural, socioeconomic disruption that completely defined the lives of millions of Kenyans.
And what's fascinating about this is who was actually doing the governing. The sources highlight that the whole structure was overwhelmingly dominated by British officials and a tiny minority of European settlers.
Right, and many of these settlers, particularly those who arrived after World War I, they came from the British military or the officer class.
Which must have set a certain tone.
It gave the entire colonial structure an inherently defensive, rigid, and quite authoritarian tone. Land ownership wasn't just about economic power for them. It was a matter of perceived British security and prestige.
So for the African population, what were the options?
The options were stark. You could reside in the designated reserves, you could migrate to the cities like Nairobi, which were completely inadequate, or, more often, you could live as squatters on the European farms in the highlands.
Which sounds pretty precarious.
Extremely. You'd work for free for several days a week, often with your whole family, just in exchange for the temporary use of a small parcel of land.
Yeah.
It created this deeply exploitative and unsustainable system.
And I imagine that system, fragile as it was then put under immense pressure.
It was completely shattered by the effects of World War II. While the war initially brought a temporary economic boom, the demobilization afterwards created just tremendous strain.
Because the war effort had required a massive expansion of the East African military forces.
Massive. It swelled from around 11,000 to a staggering 225,000 strong.
Wow.
And when these men returned home after 1945, the stability of the colony immediately started to erode.
Because you suddenly have all these crises converging at once.
Exactly. The sources show it clearly. You had spiraling social issues, rising unemployment, which was made so much worse by the influx of returned soldiers.
And then housing shortages, I assume.
Acute housing shortages in urban centers like Nairobi, plus the rising cost of living due to inflation. This combination inevitably led to rising levels of crime and social tension.
And the sources point to this being concentrated among certain groups.
Yes, the unrest was particularly concentrated among the poorer Africans, especially Kikuyu, who flocked to the burgeoning shanty towns, looking for work that simply didn't exist.
So the administration wasn't just worried about crime, they were actively paranoid about the military implications of this.
Oh, deeply paranoid.
Yeah.
Commanders had noted in reports that while these East African troops performed valuable service, they often didn't meet the disciplinary standards of other troops, particularly when they were serving outside of combat.
So they saw them as a potential threat.
A huge internal security risk. You have this large, trained, but now completely disillusioned and unemployed African military cohort. It was a ticking time bomb.
And that's the key linkage, isn't it? The colonial response, rather than addressing the root causes, the land, the inequality was to
rely on the security hammer. They just enacted more and more legislation to regulate African activities, doubling down on the law and order approach.
which only further alienated the population. But despite this repression, political resistance was beginning to coalesce. We start to see the emergence of the Kenya African Union, or KAU.
Right, which initially tried to be the official African voice for constitutional change. And it's very telling that the Internal Security Working Committee, the ISWC, which was formed in 1950 to monitor threats.
What did they think of KAU?
They actually viewed KAU at the time as moderate and constitutional. They saw the political agitation, but they completely missed the revolutionary threat bubbling just beneath the surface.
And KAU was led by Jomo Kenyatta, who becomes this central figure.
Absolutely central. He'd been instrumental in organizing the 1945 Pan-African Congress. He returns to Kenya in 1946, becomes KAU president in 1947, and he's promoting a nonviolent, unity-focused approach.
And this wasn't new for him. He'd already done the intellectual work.
He had. His 1938 book, Facing Mount Kenya, was this profound celebration and detailing of Agikuyu culture. He was asserting African identity long before he was leading a political party.
So the moderate political path was clearly laid out by Kenyatta and KAU. But this is where the institutional failure of the colonial government becomes just glaringly obvious.
It's driven by Cold War paranoia. They were so fixated on combating the specter of communism that they ignored the tangible local threats that were right in front of them.
The sources reveal this profound disconnect, don't they?
A huge bureaucratic and political disconnect. The 1951 ISWC report, even though it was focused on security, made a stark sociological diagnosis. It noted the massive disparities in wealth, the class cleavage, which was, and I'm quoting, accentuated by the coincidence of a color cleavage.
So their own internal security committee is pointing to race and class inequality as the root problem.
Explicitly. The report stated the situation would inevitably give rise to feelings of envy and animosity. Even the Attorney General at the time, John Wyatt, stressed that the primary problem was social and agrarian, and that true security meant land reform and social improvement.
Yet none of that advice was translated into meaningful policy.
None. As the historian Ferretti argues, these intelligent warnings were largely ignored until disorder actually erupted.
Why?
Because the authorities preferred simple law and order explanations. They didn't require expensive, difficult land transfers or political concessions. Dissent, no matter how justified by grinding poverty, was just seen as a breach of peace, or worse, a communist plot waiting to happen.
And this failure to address the root causes leads directly to the critical political turning point.
It does. The whole system of constitutional gradualness, this long-term colonial plan, it finally breaks down completely when the African members boycott the Legislative Council from November 1958.
That's a withdrawal of legitimacy.
It is. It's a key moment because you have to remember, colonial officials had literally penciled in independence for Kenya for maybe 1975.
That far out.
That far out. The 1958 boycott was the political act that forced their hand. It compelled the colonial authorities to concede to demands for a constitutional conference and immediately reversed their decades-long policy of gradual control.
So the African politicians had finally found the leverage they needed.
They had. And the irony is just so thick. The failure to listen to the moderates created the vacuum that the militants eventually filled, which accelerated the very process Britain was desperately trying to contain.
So that acceleration toward independence was achieved through this dramatic mix of, on the one hand, brutal localized violence, the Mau Mau uprising, and on the other, high-stakes constitutional negotiation. This period, from 52 to 63 is just absolutely critical.
It is. The colonial government, already primed for that law and order response, declared a state of emergency in October 1952. And this declaration was tied directly to the political deadlock and, frankly, the failure of intelligence to anticipate the depth of militancy that had developed.
Primarily among the Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru communities.
Correct.
And the very first thing the colonial state did was neutralize the political leadership, Operation Jock Scott.
Yes, the mass arrest and detention of Jomo Kenyatta and other KU leaders. This was a deliberate, calculated move.
Let's talk about that calculation. Was the British administration truly convinced Kenyatta was the military leader of Mau Mau, or was his arrest a more cynical way to just decapitate all African political organization, even the moderate parts?
The sources really suggest the latter. While the settlers desperately wanted to pin the violence on him, and the colonial office was definitely influenced by that, Kenyatta had publicly condemned the Mau Mau violence.
So it wasn't about the evidence.
It was about symbolism. For the administration, he was the most potent symbol of African nationalism. By associating him with the Marxist nationalist camp and jailing him, they hoped to delegitimize the entire movement. It was an act of political convenience masked as an act of security.
And that convenience backfired spectacularly.
Completely. Imprisoning Kenyatta stripped away the moderate voice that had been seeking a nonviolent path. And, crucially, it turned him into a national hero, a symbol of resistance to be campaigned for relentlessly by groups like Ambu Patel's Release Jomo Committee.
So the conflict that ensued under this state of emergency was marked by a stunning asymmetry.
We have to reflect on the raw numbers to grasp the human cost. During the entire rebellion, only 32 white settlers were killed.
32.
32. Yet the counterinsurgency resulted in the deaths of over 20,000 black Kenyans. And that figure tragically includes both Mau Mau fighters and African loyalists who were fighting for the British.
That's not a civil war of equals.
No, it was a state applying overwhelming brutal force to restore order.
And the nature of the Mau Mau threat itself was viewed with extreme fear by the settlers.
Oh, absolutely. It was a secret society bound by oaths, and the administration went to great lengths to emphasize the atavistic nature of the rituals. You see interviews mentioning ceremonies at night, forcing people to use animal parts or other things designed to scare people into joining.
And the authorities used this.
They heavily publicized stories of atrocities, like body mutilation, to successfully demonize the enemy as an atavistic return to savagery, rather than a legitimate response to political and economic injustice.
And that narrative provided the justification for the repression that followed.
It did. It was total war against a segment of the population. We saw mass arrests, like Operation Anvil in April 1954, which was essentially a siege of Nairobi that rounded up 10,000 alleged supporters. Thousands were immediately sent to detention camps.
And these detention camps, often called the pipeline, were where the most extreme forms of state brutality occurred.
Yes. These were not just prisons. They were part of a systematic attempt at rehabilitation and breaking the oath.
The first-hand accounts are crucial here for understanding the reality of the emergency.
They are. Gitu Wakaheri, a Mau Mau veteran, provided these chilling accounts of his time in the camps. He described a regime where food was insufficient, routine beatings were common, and prisoners were forced into pointless, back-breaking labor.
And the accounts of severe brutality are deeply disturbing.
Widespread reports of sexual assault and documented cases of castration. He specifically noted one incident where 14 people died, and he said some had their testicles smashed with a club. These details, they're not incidental. They underscore the degree of systematic violence the state was willing to inflict to break the will of the resistance.
This violence was a means to an end, the restoration of authority. And by the end of 1956, the military campaign was deemed a success.
Militarily, yes. The resistance was broken, culminating in the capture of the key leader, Dedan Kimathi, in October 1956.
And that victory was famously secured by a special branch officer, Ian Henderson, who relied heavily on Mau Mau turncoats.
Which highlighted that the most effective counterinsurgency often involves exploiting existing internal divisions.
So, once the military threat was contained, Britain's strategy shifted immediately.
Right. From absolute suppression to managing the political transition. They realized that physically suppressing the movement wasn't the same as solving the political problem. The long-term plan of waiting until 1975 was now completely untenable.
It was too expensive, the international condemnation.
The sheer political cost of the emergency was too high, which led directly to the Lancaster House conferences, starting in 1960. The question was no longer if independence would happen, but how the power would be transferred and to whom.
And in the political vacuum created by the crackdown, two major African parties emerged.
Largely divided along ethnic and regional lines. First, you had the Kenya African National Union, KNU, led by figures like Kenyatta, Odinga, and Maboya. They wanted a strong, unitary, centralized government.
Reflecting the aspirations of the larger ethnic groups, the Kikuyu and Luo.
Primarily, yes. And on the other side, you had the Kenya African Democratic Union, or KADU, led by Ronald Ngala.
And KADU advocated for a federal or Majimbo constitution.
This was a deep, foundational political battle. KDO argued that KNU was dominated by the two large ethnic groups and that the smaller regional groups needed a decentralized federal system to protect their land rights and resources from central control.
And the entire independence negotiation hinged on this KNU versus KDU rivalry.
It did. But the political centrality of Kenyatta, even while he was in detention, could not be ignored. KNU won the 1961 elections, but then delivered this masterstroke of political leverage.
They refused to form a government.
They refused to form a government until Kenyatta was released in August of 1961. This forced the colonial hand and positioned Kenyatta as the essential, inevitable father of the nation.
So while Kenyatta was jailed, Ngala actually formed a government supported by the remaining settler party, trying to solidify his position.
He did. He tried to push the Majimbo agenda. But once Kenyatta was out, his symbolic power was just unstoppable. He rejoined the Legislative Council almost immediately.
And the constitutional negotiations at Lancaster House eventually agreed in 1962 that Kenya would adopt a Majimbo constitution.
A decentralized framework, yes, but critically, still with a strong central government. It was an attempt to balance Kenya's political strength with KNU's minority demands.
But the pace after that was just lightning fast.
Incredibly fast. Kenya achieved internal self-government, which they call Madaraka, on June 1st, 1963, with Kenyatta as prime minister.
And that was swiftly followed by full independence, Jamhuri, on December 12, 1964.
So the military campaign of Mau Mau, combined with the successful political boycott and the sheer cost of the emergency, paradoxically forced an accelerated yet controlled transfer of power, and one that was focused, above all, on securing Britain's future strategic access.
So, forging a new Kenyan national identity, this process was immediately defined by the battle over the Constitution, specifically the fight for centralization.
That's right. Although the 1962 Lancaster House Conference had agreed on that Majimbo, that federal framework, to appease regional interests, KNU won the 1963 elections, and they wasted absolutely no time in consolidating power.
It was a rapid dismantling of the federalist structure that KADU had fought so hard for. And the key, as the sources reveal, it lay in control over security.
This is a crucial detail that links right back to our central theme: internal security and stability. The Kenyan government ensured that the centrally controlled Police Service Commission received the power to appoint the Inspector General of the Police.
And that Inspector General then had sole responsibility for all police postings across the country.
Exactly. By centralizing the police and security forces, they effectively neutralized any regional security autonomy that the Majimbo Constitution was supposed to grant. They stripped the smaller regions of their primary defense against central overreach.
And the political result of that was equally swift.
In 1964, Ronald Ngala, the leader of KADU, he recognized the inevitable. He disbanded the party and eventually joined Kenyatta's government,
Which marks this rapid transition toward a de facto one-party state.
where political unity was imposed from the top by the dominant Kikuyu and Luo leaders.
So this rapid political consolidation had to address the core economic legacy of discontent. And that was, again, land hunger.
Right. And Britain was determined to leave behind a stable, functioning economy, largely to protect its remaining commercial interests. So they provided significant financial support.
Like the 5 million ton loan and the Million Acres scheme.
Exactly. The scheme was dedicated to purchasing European farms, often at inflated prices, for African resettlement.
We need to be clear about the purpose of that scheme, though. It was a political mechanism funded by Britain to ensure an orderly, nonviolent land transfer.
It bought out the remaining, often politically influential European settlers, and it stabilized the economy to reduce immediate volatile unrest.
But did it address the underlying injustice? Did it provide equitable land distribution to the landless masses?
No, absolutely not. While it provided land to a fortunate few, militancy continued precisely because the scheme failed to satisfy the true demand for equitable distribution.
And the Kenya Land Freedom Army, the KLFA, was the major vehicle for this ongoing discontent.
Yes, and the KLFA wasn't just criminal. It was an ideological expression of the unresolved agrarian grievances rooted in colonial dispossession.
And the sources confirm the serious nature of this post-independence militancy. The KLFA oath, for instance.
It included a pledge to kill loyal Africans and Europeans, which shows that the violence and the deep sense of betrayal didn't just end with Jamhuri. The government was aware that KLFA oath administrators were widespread. They estimated probably 20,000 members in just one district alone.
So the land reforms were a bandage, not a cure.
A very small bandage on a very large wound.
Now let's pivot to Kenyatta's governing style itself, because that was instrumental in achieving the stability that Britain prized so highly.
It was. Shared Ralph, who worked closely with him, noted that Kenyatta's leadership brought a powerful stability that was immediately vital. It even secured support from communities like Kenyan Indians, despite Kenyatta's own practices of discriminating against them in top government jobs.
And there's an anecdote provided by Shared Ralph about Kenyatta's use of the presidential prerogative that shows just how calculated and, frankly, how powerful his authoritarianism was. Can you walk us through that specific example? It reveals so much.
It's chilling. Ralph recounts Kenyatta's approach to dealing with convicts on death row for armed robbery. Now, Kenyatta feared that pardoning them would encourage more crime and instability.
So he wouldn't pardon them.
But he wouldn't issue an explicit no either, which might have created a political incident. Instead, he would simply delay the process indefinitely. He would refuse to sign the pardon papers.
So by refusing to act?
By refusing to act, he effectively ensured the executions would eventually take place without his signature, shielding himself from direct political responsibility while projecting maximum authority. It was calculated cruelty used for state stabilization.
That is the hallmark of a leader who understands how to wield symbolic power alongside legal authority. But beneath this centralized stability, deep ideological rifts were forming, the most notable being the split with his vice president, Odinga.
That split was both ideological and geopolitical. Odinga, the vice president, had been traveling extensively to communist countries, which created suspicion that he was a Soviet agent.
So you have this major ideological divergence within Kenyan.
You do. Between Kenyatta's pragmatic, Western-leaning government focused on stability and attracting capital, and Odinga's push for a more socialist, self-reliant economic structure.
This came to a head in 1966 when Odinga resigned to form the Kenya People's Union, the KPU.
And his critique, which he famously articulated in his book Not Yet Uhuru, Not Yet Freedom, was profound. He argued that independence was a facade.
How so?
He believed that Europeans still controlled Kenya from behind the scenes through economic levers, and that the nation needed genuine economic self-reliance, not dependence on foreign aid.
And the KPU was quickly suppressed.
Seen as an existential threat to Kenya's centralized control, it was crushed.
Now, if we fast forward, we can see these historical rifts metastasizing into modern Kenyan politics.
Absolutely. The centralization achieved by Kenyatta and the subsequent suppression of ideological opposition, it entrenched the role of ethnicity. Kenya remains a highly ethnicized country with over 40 communities and diverse, often competing interests.
So, ethnicity isn't just a cultural fact. It's identified as the critical component in the political space. It influences affiliations, resource distribution, voting patterns, just as it did during the Kanukadu split.
Studies confirm it. Voting is overwhelmingly based on ethnic affiliation. Kikuyus, generally voting for Uhuru Kenyatta, Luos for Raila Odinga. The political environment is driven less by clear ideological platforms and more by, ethnic consolidation.
And this concentration is formally enforced by the legal framework itself.
It is. The electoral law requires a presidential candidate to secure at least 25% of the vote in at least half of the counties.
A very specific mechanism.
It is, and it mandates geographical spread, which essentially forces parties into ethnic amalgamations, coalitions like the National Super Alliance, NASA, or the Jubilee Alliance, just to meet the threshold.
So they aren't forming coalitions based on shared political philosophy.
No, they're doing it out of pure necessity to govern.
It sounds incredibly tactical. We read in the sources that partnerships, like the 2013 alliance between William Ruto and Uhuru Kenyatta, were described in focus groups as being tactical.
Driven primarily by their collective ICC cases and that pervasive winner-takes-all mentality associated with accessing state resources. This is power sharing for access, not for ideological governance.
It all comes down to that. If you win the presidency, your ethnic group gets preferential access to jobs, contracts, resources, so the goal isn't to win an ideological debate.
The goal is to construct the broadest possible ethnic coalition to guarantee victory and access.
And finally, we have to acknowledge the critical role of judicial precedents in shaping this modern political landscape. While the political history points toward consolidation and authoritarianism, the Supreme Court has emerged as a crucial independent check.
The nullification of the 2017 presidential election, following the case brought by Raila Odinga against the Electoral Commission, the IEBC, that was a seismic event.
A huge moment.
That ruling established far stricter electoral transparency standards, and it demonstrated the judiciary's power. It fundamentally alters how political coalitions have to organize and operate. It demands greater adherence to legal measures in a system otherwise dominated by these tactical power plays. It forces the pursuit of power to, at least legally, operate within tighter constitutional boundaries.
So, looking back across our deep dive, the evidence really confirms that the transfer of power in Kenya was neither hasty nor was it purely magnanimous.
Not at all. It was an orderly, pragmatic transfer dictated by two constants in Whitehall: maintaining internal security and ensuring Kenya remained stable enough to safeguard vital British economic and, most importantly, strategic interests.
Britain wasn't simply fleeing Africa.
No, they were adapting their defense requirements to an acceptable minimum. The geopolitical context of the early 1960s, with rising insecurity in places like Aden, where Britain maintained a crucial military base, meant that having reliable access points in East Africa, particularly in Kenya, was paramount.
So in the end, Britain lost the politically untenable army base that the settlers had relied upon, but they gained something essential.
They gained guaranteed continuity. Continuity in terms of access for communications, overflying, staging, and training rights. And this continuity was achieved precisely because defense and internal security interests were intricately woven into the final terms of the political power transfer.
And this reliance on stability, it came at a cost to the young nation's democratic development.
A huge cost. Britain's desire to ensure a stable post-colonial regime led them to actively bolster Kenyatta's central authority. They used security provisions and direct military assistance.
Like deploying 24 Brigade to quell the 1964 Kenya Rifles mutiny just after independence.
Exactly. And they did that in explicit exchange for securing ongoing military access. They essentially armed and stabilized the Kenyatta state, ensuring that future threats to Kenya's stability could be dealt with locally without compromising British interests.
This leaves us with a truly provocative final thought. The entire history of Kenyan politics, from that initial Kanukadu split to the modern coalitions like NASA and Jubilee, shows that political alliances are overwhelmingly driven by pragmatic, tactical considerations.
Collective ICC cases, ethnic consolidation, accessing power and resources, that winner-takes-all mentality.
It's rarely about a foundational ideological vision. So, given this complex and, let's be honest, cynical history of political mergers, how does Kenya balance the necessary pursuit of political unity through ethnic coalition with the deeper, more complex need for genuine ideological democracy?
A question that defines Kenya's political future. Thank you for participating in this deep dive.
Until next time.